Just come on. My name is Zoe Mills. I am the Adult Programming and Community Outreach Librarian here at Tredyffrin Public Library. We are located in Stratford, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia for any who are not local to Pennsylvania. I do want to invite everyone to utilize the chat or QA function throughout Ryan's presentation. You can ask questions along the way or make comments along the way, and we'll try to integrate it into the presentation. First, I want to say thanks again for coming out. All of us at the library have been proud and delighted to be able to serve the community in a multitude of ways throughout the pandemic. Virtual programs like this one, plus electronic materials, reference chat, curbside pickup, and more have kept the community inspired, engaged, and connected. But the pandemic has also caused a loss of revenue for our libraries and has increased many costs. Now it is likely that cuts to services and programs may come. If you can give any amount, Tredyffrin Public Library and Paoli Library are very grateful for your support. Click the link in the Zoom webinar chat to donate now. And is with great pleasure to introduce historian Ryan Conroy tonight for a presentation on the Underground Railroad in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Ryan is on the board at the Phoenixville Historical Society and Springford Historical Society. Ryan also works with Mayor Peter and the Chamber of Commerce in Phoenixville. He currently has a new local history show on Voxy Pop called Timeless Tales of Phoenixville, which you can find on Facebook and Instagram. 4 episodes are currently out and new episodes are coming soon. So without further ado, Ryan Conroy.
All right. Hi, everybody. So first of all, thanks for tuning in. We have a huge amount of people that signed up for this talk. And as we were seeing people tuning in from all over the place, I saw people from Oregon, California, Colorado, Montana, and I saw even one in there from Dublin, Ireland, and of course, a lot of Chester County people. So yeah, this talk really is going to, of course, relate directly to Chester County. And a lot of people that are going to be tuned in on here are going to know places that I'm talking about, locations, buildings, people, their names. And, you know, feel free to ask questions. As Zoe said, I love questions. And, you know, I'm going to be talking, you know, with you guys and have a good conversation. And, you know, I'm going to start sharing my screen here in a minute, and you're going to hear me talking over a lot of images. And so I like to give you guys visuals. I put together a new visual presentation just for this talk. So if anybody was tuned into my Underground Railroad talk last week for Roarsford Library, this one will be different for the most part. You will hear some similar things, but it definitely will be different. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and I'm going to want you guys to, you know, enjoy the photographs and let me know, you know, what you think about a lot of them, because there's going to be some photos of now and then, a lot of photographs of things and maps, and so, you know, please enjoy. One thing that we're going to talk about right from the beginning is, you know, a lot of, you know, myths or legends of the Underground Railroad and things that you often hear about that are either true, not true, and things that kind of get often forgotten about. You know, this is a nice starting image. This is one of my favorite paintings in regards to the Underground Railroad. It shows slaves escaping, of course, from the South, making their way up north. And, you know, this image, you can see that they are in a forest area, you know, probably bordered by a farmland. This is something that would have looked very similar to Pennsylvania, especially in Chester County, coming up from Maryland into southern Chester County and keep going up into northern Chester County. You know, the Underground Railroad and these people were trying to gain freedom, and we were trying to help them as Pennsylvanians. And so, you know, one of the myths that you always, you know, kind of gets portrayed sometimes is that it was underground, which of course the name can be deceiving to people who aren't familiar with some of the details. But, you know, the term Underground Railroad, they used the word railroad because it was, the terminology was already established that they kind of formed this like terminology where like station masters and station houses and things were related to railroad terminology. But a lot of these slaves were traveling above ground. They were traveling through farm fields, through forests, on waterways like the Schuylkill River, the Delaware River. So you're going to hear a lot about that, and you're going to learn a little bit, hopefully, with some of the information that I shared, that how dangerous this operation was, and how brave these people were, the escapees, and also the people that were operating the Underground Railroad in Chester County. So this is a real general map showing the eastern and a little into the central parts of the United States Underground Railroad routes from 1850 to 1865. And of course, yeah, the Underground Railroad started way earlier than this. They believe it started possibly as early as 1810. And they think that location was actually in Columbia, Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County. So, but generally you'll see there's a lot of activity, even like in Ohio and other states, going up to Canada. But if you look in our little spot down there in southeastern Pennsylvania, there's a lot of activity. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. And there's Philadelphia, of course. There's Baltimore, there's Delaware. And we're coming into in Chester County there on the corner, right where all that red is. So it's just a nice map, kind of shows you about that area. But when you talk about the Underground Railroad, the history goes back far, and the cause of anti-slavery and abolitionism dates back to as late as the late 1600s. A lot of this happened because the United States at that time was populated obviously by a lot of English. These English weren't necessarily Quakers yet. So when the late 1600s starts happening, we have a huge influx of immigrants and new arrivals from England, Ireland, Wales, Germany, and a lot of the late 1600s Welsh, Irish, and English were primarily Quaker, and Chester County would just become heavily populated by Quakers. And to pinpoint a real good area for you guys is of course right in Tredyffrin itself. You have Tredyffrin and Radnor Township that were super early in the 1600s. They had established communities, and they established both their communities around Quaker religion and Quaker meeting houses. And the ones that were in Tredyffrin and in Radnor Township were Welsh. So they were Welsh Quakers who owned large amounts of properties, all the way going into, at the time, what was called Marion Township. It was Upper and Lower Marion were one township at the time, and bordering into Schuylkill or Charlestown Township, which is at one point what Phoenixville was part of, and Vincent Township and Pikeland Township, and those areas would, pretty much you're talking about where we're talking about, where the Tredyffrin Library is, and going down into Phoenixville and going east and west and south. And these areas, like I said, were populated by Quakers. And the Quakers brought that belief with them to the United States. They were already anti-slavery. England was already ahead of the game with abolishing slavery. And so when they came here, they brought that practice with them. The one thing that you do often gets left out a lot is in the late 1600s, when the Germans were coming into southeastern Pennsylvania, arriving in areas like Germantown, and then starting to spread west out of Germantown into Montgomery County, Chester County, Delaware County. Most of these Germans were Mennonites. And of course, you did have some Lutherans, of course, like in Trapp with the Muhlenbergs. And so you had these Lutherans and Mennonites who were also anti-slavery. And so a lot of times it often gets forgotten about is the involvement of the Pennsylvania Germans in the Underground Railroad. And of course, when you get into Chester County, a lot of our population of our Pennsylvania Germans you get in western Chester County that's bordering Lancaster. And if you know your maps from early United States or early southeastern Pennsylvania, you're going to know that in the late 1600s, that Chester County once encompassed Delaware County and also Lancaster County. Lancaster County was part of Chester County. It was a gigantic county, and it kind of gives you an idea. If you think about Delaware County, and I'm sure you've heard of Chester. Chester was originally the county seat of Chester County before Westchester was. So just to kind of give you an idea how huge Chester County was at one point. And this time period that we're talking about in the late 1600s, early 1700s is what it would look like. So in 1780, American Revolution is still happening. They passed the Gradual Abolition Act, which meant that children born to slaves that were already slaves, those children would not be born into slavery. This was a huge first step for us to abolish slavery. And of course, this was being pushed by Pennsylvanians and Philadelphia and Chester County abolitionists. And this law was huge. And then after the age of 28, the mothers of these children were at the time serving now as indentured servitude. Which indentured servants are completely different from being enslaved. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, "Oh well, I was an indentured servant, and my family was indentured servants." So I can tell you right now, my great grandmother was an indentured servant from Ireland that came here in the 1880s, but she came to the United States and only had to work in a church for a year, and then she could do whatever she wanted. So that's much different than being a slave that was brought over here for what we're talking about. So after the age of 28, they were allowed to become free according to that act. By 1810, believe it or not, there were fewer than 1,000 slaves in the state of Pennsylvania. And then by 1847, there were zero, according to all the census records. And so you can see Pennsylvania was ahead of the game. And then, of course, in the late 70s, not too much longer, in that before 1810, Pennsylvania had abolished slavery. And so Pennsylvania was the first to do so. And that had a lot to do with the Quakers and the Mennonites in Chester County. By 17, and going back 20 years before 1810, kind of give you an idea of like population. In 1790, 63% of the African American population in Pennsylvania were free. So they were really kind of working that number up, and it did take some time, of course, to get there. But this is all kind of a background of the Underground Railroad beginnings. And in the 1820s and 1830s, you're going to go see that the development of the Underground Railroad was starting to really take off. And the development of the Underground Railroad were being started by locations of people that were already abolitionists. They already were friends with each other throughout the county. And so when they were coming up with these ideas, they were trying to come up with routes. And these routes would be determined on the station master houses. And so when we start talking about individual people here, that's what I'm getting at here. So jumping forward a little bit, which is what really escalated the Underground Railroad and made it extremely dangerous, is related to this copy of an original broadside. As you can see, they're advertising fugitive slaves, but they're letting you know that what they were calling the slave hunter is among us. They're referring to bounty hunters. And when the United States government passed the law in 1850 called the Fugitive Slave Act, that actually gave permission to people who own slaves to hire bounty hunters to cross state lines into other states that did not have slaves, like Pennsylvania, and come hunt down their slaves for a amount of money that would be paid for by the slave owner. This changed everything and made the Underground Railroad bigger and more dangerous. And unfortunately, the United States law, that government, overruled a lot of the state rules, and so now is up really now getting narrowed down to Chester County. These individuals taking charge and doing what they thought was right as humans for other humans, and this why I find it fascinating and interesting, and we're going to get into a lot of like what stuff I like, a lot of human interest stories, and these people who did what they could to help other people. You will see things like these ads that were put in public newspapers, big newspapers. This one you'll see, it says the Delaware Gazette, that they're putting in ads for their slaves that had their way out of captivity from the South, that made their way up, and they were allowed to put ads in newspapers, advertising ages, names, descriptions, and saying how much they will pay for each one. And this one here is talking about 3 different ones, paying a sum of $50 each. But they want anybody now, that, and this is where once again it becomes a little dangerous, where they were allowed to put an ad in, and now random people could see things like this, and people that weren't necessarily quote unquote bounty hunters could actually do this on their own, which becomes very dangerous. And when you have these station masters that were operating under secrecy, they also had to be worried about their neighbors. And luckily in Chester County, because there were so many abolitionists and that movement was so strong, it wasn't too bad. And they could trust a lot of their neighbors, but they still had to be very, very careful. But one thing to remember also is that the Quakers did say, hey, we don't like slavery, but there were a lot of Quakers who didn't want anything to do with the Underground Railroad. And we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes here, when I'm going to talk about one of my favorite people, and what type of opposition he received even from his own people. Here's a really cool map of specifically showing Chester County. And you'll see the surrounding counties at the time period in the 1800s, of course, Lancaster, Bucks, Montgomery, and Delaware. And you're going to see, look how many routes that were coming right through Chester County, coming from Delaware, coming from Maryland, coming from Lancaster County out west, and then coming into Philadelphia or Montgomery County from out of Chester County. I'm going to zoom in here. Hopefully you can see some of these towns, of course. There's Tredyffrin, Phoenixville, Schuylkill, Charlestown, East Pikeland, Downingtown, with Zebulon Nut Thomas, Malvern. Going down to southern Chester County, you're going to see this southern eastern Chester County, which had a large amount of station houses and station masters on the Underground Railroad. Of course, Kennett was huge and involved in it, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later with a photograph. But Pocopson, Birmingham, East Marlboro, Avondale, New Garden, of course, and going all the way down to southern Chester County, there's Nottingham and Oxford, and you'll see where they're coming in at, and they were coming down through Maryland, getting into those bottom spots, the Hosanna Church, Ann Preston and George Taylor's house, and then getting up north. I see someone said, what did the different colors mean? They're showing the different routes. So those 3 routes that you see, purple, red, and green, they were specific routes. So if they came into, say, let's go up to the Speakmans, okay, that Speakmans are specifically receiving enslaved people from Daniel Gibbons' house in Lancaster County. And they're going to be coming right across into the Speakmans. And from the Speakmans, they're going to Kimberton, at Kimber and Lewis, and then going over to Phoenixville, Elijah Pennypacker, and he's bringing them over into Montgomery County directly to Norristown. And then you'll see the red line is very similar, but it comes straight up through the center of Chester County, and they're taking them over also to Norristown. And ultimately, you can see where those lines are all going, Philadelphia. And William Still right there in Philadelphia. So that's what those lines mean. That's a good question. Okay. Chester County had a lot of attention because of, like I keep mentioning, how outspoken they were and how many people you just saw on that map. That one of the most famous of all times, Frederick Douglass. This is a little ad in the Chester County newspaper advertising a speech by Frederick Douglass at the Horticultural Hall in Westchester on the evening of July 14th, 1863. He is now promoting the enlistment of colored troops. So now you say that, this is moving forward, of course, a little bit, but the Emancipation Proclamation and now the recruitment of African Americans in Chester County to enlist in the Union Army. But Frederick Douglass was all over Chester County way before that, and promoting the abolitionist movement. And he was friends with all those people. This is another map. I know people keep asking about these maps. So the Chester County map here, that's going to show a little bit more detail, a little neat little slave. I see someone ask, I'm going to talk about this while I'm talking. How did they choose the routes? So a lot of times there would be people down along those border areas, almost kind of like outposts, that would, if they encountered them, they might be the contact through this person's house or that person's house. And wherever they take them, now that's going to be their route. But a lot of times you hear the one story, of course, with them following the North Star. If they were going up north, they knew they had to get north, and they were just trying to make contact with somebody that they could trust. And that's kind of like how that happened. So, like I said, it was very dangerous. But you can see this map. This is all over. Here's Kennett, of course, New Garden, and we're going to go up to where we're from here. And you got Pocopson. This is a lot of the southern Chester County area where London Grove Meeting House. You're going to see a lot of meeting houses. New Garden Meeting. They're all Quaker meeting houses. So I've shown you enough maps. So I'm going to show you a picture here. This is the Underground Railroad conductors, some famous ones. And we're going to talk about a couple of these people, but Isaac Mendenhall, John Vickers, Grace Anna Lewis, and of course, famous friends of the abolitionists. Sojourner Truth, one of the most famous abolitionists of all time, and John Greenleaf Whittier and Harriet Tubman, of course.
Speaking of Harriet Tubman, we have two questions that are asking if the Minty in the news article was referencing Harriet Tubman.
I don't. I think I want to say for sure, but I think it is, because that article was around that time period where that would have matched her age and description. So I think that is accurate. That's a good question. Any other question? There's another one.
It was just two people asking the same question.
Oh, the same
would be
one.
relevant
Okay.
to.
Okay. So individual people. So this guy here is my favorite. This is Elijah Pennypacker. Elijah Pennypacker lived right on the edge of Phoenixville Borough. At the time, this would have been Schuylkill Township. He lived in this little section, this tiny little village right on the edge there, called Corner Stores, which is on the corner of Route 23 and White Horse Road. And if somebody knows where that is, say if you're leaving Phoenixville on Route 23, like you're going to Valley Forge, you hit that traffic light where you pass John Kennedy Ford dealership, and that's right where that is, right at that traffic light. So his house was located on the right side if you're going in that direction. It sits behind the total rental house location where you can rent, like, the lifts and all that kind of stuff. Behind there, yes, this is why we have a Pennypacker florist in Phoenixville. They are related to him. Behind there is his house. Elijah Pennypacker's house is still standing. I'm going to show you a photo of it here in a minute. And Elijah is a very interesting man. So Elijah is born into a well-to-do family. The Pennypackers, for those that are in our area, I'm sure you either know a Pennypacker or you've heard the name. And of course, one of the most famous Pennypackers is Samuel Pennypacker, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, lived at Pennypacker Mills in Montgomery County. But Samuel was originally from Phoenixville. A lot of Pennypackers were from Phoenixville. And Elijah, of course, was one of them. Elijah was born into a well-to-do family. He worked his way into law school and eventually was on the state legislature. He was a state representative in the early 1830s. He actually quit during his term because he felt that his focus should be on the abolitionist movement. And he gave up his politics and focused the rest of his life on the operation of the Underground Railroad, as his house was a station master's house. Also, one of the first things he did at the same time of getting involved in creating his house to be a station master house, he was actually involved in this really interesting movement. And I definitely wanted to mention this because we saw someone chime in here from Dublin, Ireland, that Elijah was a supporter of a movement that was called the Famine Society, which you don't hear a lot about. When the Irish potato famine or the Irish genocide was happening, they were fleeing, of course, to the United States. This is when we're getting our huge influx of Irish immigrants. And there was a ton of them coming into Chester County, and especially into Phoenixville. And Elijah was a part of this group that were attached with the Quakers that would take these people in, find clothing, find food, and find jobs for them. And he was very much involved in this. It's a very interesting movement that you don't hear a lot about. But he was a big helper, and as you could tell right from the bat with him, is that he was a person who wanted to help his fellow man and put his money where his mouth was. So across from Elijah's house on the other corner is the I see just him and his miss. He was primarily the main person in it. His wife he had a first wife. He was married twice. His first wife was a Quaker. He was actually not a Quaker yet with his first wife. He was a Mennonite. He becomes a Quaker with his first wife while going to the Schuylkill Friends meeting house that is pictured right here. That is still standing. You can go see that right on the other side of the corner from his house. It is still an active congregation as well as an active meeting house. So first wife passes away young. He marries again. The second wife is also involved. And I'm going to tell a story about her in a second. That there is Elijah Pennypacker's house. That was built pre-Revolutionary War, and that was built by his father. So when he took over the estate, it's a beautiful house, beautiful colonial country house, and it faces, the side of the house actually faces White Horse Road. So when you drive by, don't miss it, because the front of the house faces the other direction, because originally that was more open in front and went all the way down to the Pickering Creek. So that's Elijah's house. Elijah had a long history with the Underground Railroad and was involved in it as early as the 1830s, going into the 1860s. Somebody asked, is it occupied or a historic building? It is occupied. It is a private residence. I am jealous that somebody gets to live in that house because I would love to live in that house. But the people that live in there, as far as I know, are definitely aware of its history, as far as I know, and which is really cool. So Elijah had built up quite an established station master house. And I'm going to read you a couple facts about him, and that kind of give you an idea of, what he was doing there and how active that location was. It's believed that he had processed several hundred enslaved people through his property. And as far as research has provided, not one of them were ever caught. He was very good at hiding them and moving them on and taking care for them and providing them what they needed to get them to the next location across Montgomery County, across the Schuylkill River into Norristown. They believe that his property was operating as a station master house for, believe it or not, 23 years. So from 1840, when it was firmly established, to 1863. So that's a long time, 23 years that he was operating under. This was his job. This was his life every day. Of course, because of that, it brought bad attention to his property, and the bounty hunters knew who he was and were constantly trying to get at his property and trying to catch people there. And there's a story that one time Elijah wasn't home and his wife was not home either, but his wife's mother, so his mother-in-law, was at the house, and bounty hunters show up at the house. And right before they got there, they had somebody in the house already. They had an escaped person who was in the house, and she quickly hurried him out through the woods. And they came up to the door, and she knew that she had to somehow delay these guys because they were hot on a trail and so they said, this is a quote from Elijah actually talking about the incident that when she told him what happened afterwards, that she was very good at entertaining people, and she tried to offer them coffee and biscuits, and at first the guy said no, and they were about to walk away because they felt that she was up to something. And then she just put on a really good show and talked them into it, and talked them into having some coffee for a while, and just started talking their ears off to delay them enough that they got far enough away to another person, and got them over the Schuylkill River into Montgomery County. So, like, we were talking about how, like, it wasn't just that person that, you got Elijah, but his mother-in-law, who also had to agree what was happening and had to be safe and had to be on the same page. It involved everybody that was around that area. It was a community effort. One thing that he was known to do was he was known to transport children and women inside a wagon that would be a hidden wagon disguised somehow, and they would go across the roads with men walking along the side of it, and to try and disguise it, make it not look like it was hiding enslaved people inside to get him across the Schuylkill River. So they would cross the bridge at the Schuylkill River over Phoenixville into what is now Montclair. Of course, at the time, it was Upper Providence. Its name was Lumberville before that. But getting them over into Montclair to the Fitzwater Station, which is in Port Providence, was a big goal, getting them across the river. And they had to be very careful because it couldn't bring them just over across the bridge all the time, because people started figuring out, and the bounty hunters knew. So they would actually wait on the other side of the bridge for them and check all these wagons. So they had to start fording the river. And the do you have names of the African American? William Still was one that I talked about earlier. He was from Philadelphia. He's one of the most famous abolitionists of all times and was African American. So I'm going to show you a picture of the Fitzwater Station in a minute, but Elijah Pennypacker is, I'm sorry, this is the Fitzwater Station here. I wanted to show you this picture because we're talking about the story here, which is a current restaurant. You can go there to eat. It was a station master house that was directly connected with Elijah Pennypacker. So get him across the river and across the Schuylkill Canal into this location, rest up a little bit, eat, make sure they were okay, and then keep them moving into Montgomery County, farther into Montgomery County than Norristown. There's we mentioned this one man a little bit earlier. There was a little photograph of those 6 people in the photograph. John Greenleaf Whittier, who was a very famous abolitionist, had a quote about Elijah Pennypacker. And the quote was, in mind, body, and brave championship of the cause of freedom, he was one of the most remarkable men I ever knew. What's really interesting about Elijah is I believe he's always very much overlooked. There was a story where he would actually go around and preach to Quaker meetings as a minister. And one time he went and did a speech in 1848 in Philadelphia. And during his sermon, he had stated that the misdirection of the human mind by which men are led to tolerate and patronize legalized and popular crimes. What he was referencing there by legalized crimes was slavery. He was very outspoken about it. And believe it or not, some of the members in the audience actually found his thoughts offensive or outspoken and told him to sit down and stop talking. And, according to Elijah, he was a man who was universally beloved and was very revered by a lot of people who knew him. So the fact that when he was silenced by his own society, it kind of said a lot. And it kind of what I talked about a little bit earlier. Not every Quaker was anti-slavery, or not say they weren't anti-slavery necessarily, but they did not want to be involved. You have things like that now where people are like, hey, yeah, I'll put I'll do this, or I'll put a sign out in my yard, or I'll do this. But when it comes to actually taking action, people are like, I'm good. And that's kind of like what happened there. But the same year that one of my favorite writers of all time, and you're going to know who I'm talking about here, Henry David Thoreau, who of course was a writer, he was an activist and a naturalist. The same year that Elijah was told to sit down and shut up pretty much at the meeting, Thoreau gave his famous lecture called Civil Disobedience, which of course was one of the most influential writings of all time. It had influenced Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and many other people who referenced that lecture. Elijah, could have been somebody like that, where he should be more famous in history. And that's why I'm talking about him now, because he needs to get some attention. But so we're talking about Elijah Pennypacker quite a bit here. I'm going to move on to some other areas closer to Tredyffrin. So Elijah Pennypacker also had a direct connection to another station master's house. This man went by the name of Lewis Peart, who originally lived in Lampeter in Lancaster County, and moved to Tredyffrin Township in 1844. He was already an abolitionist, very well established, had these connections already, and moved into Tredyffrin and immediately set up the station master house as soon as he got his house in 1844. He was also well known in the area and had a lot of connections, like I said, with Elijah Pennypacker, but also he had a lot of connections with the Kimbers and the Lewises in Kimberton. And so now he's got 2 different routes that if people came through his house, he could either send them to one or the other. And Mr. Peart, who was in an area in Lampeter Township, Lancaster County, some people might have heard of the Christiana riots, which involved a lot of anti-slavery and things like this. Somebody asked where this house is located, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. This is the Blue Ball Tavern, which is in Tredyffrin Township. This was close to Mr. Peart's house. This will kind of give you an idea of, Tredyffrin Township is not that big, but there were multiple station houses in here. So sometimes you will see station master houses that are really kind of grouped together in a kind of a small area. And then you'll have other ones that are more out in the country, almost kind of when you get out into like southern Chester County, they'll be more spread out. But this is the second Blue Ball Tavern, which was located on Old Lancaster Road, and was built about 1790. And it was a location, like I said, and they brought slaves through here. And the runaways were hidden in secret rooms above the kitchen or in a woodshed. You can see in the back, there's probably the woodshed in the back there. And the kitchen probably also would have been in the back of the location. And the locations like that where they would have hiding spots could really vary. A woodshed like that, someone opened the door and they would be right there. Sometimes if they had a hiding spot, like a secret room above the kitchen, that would have been more of a secret location, which a lot of people will think and associate with the Underground Railroad a lot more, is these secret hiding spots. Elijah Pennypacker had them. He had one in his barn. He had one in the basement of his house. And believe it or not, the one in the barn was a tunnel that went underneath from his tunnel, underneath the White Horse Road into the woods. So if somebody came, he would hurry them up in there and tell them to get out. They would go underneath the ground in this tunnel, underneath the road, get into the woods as far as they could, and just start running away. So yes, they did have a lot of hiding spaces. There were, quote unquote, actually were a little underground tunnels at times. And, but, that kind of gives you an idea a little bit. I'm going to show you a picture of one in a little bit, but.
We do have a question about the Blue Ball Tavern.
Yes.
Someone called Mike is asking if it is still standing or which street it was located on.
That was actually located on Old Lancaster Road. There was a first Blue Ball Tavern, which was built way earlier. It was actually one of the oldest taverns in Chester County. I believe that the first one is still standing. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I think this one's gone, and the older one is actually still standing. And this one's closer to Route 30. The other one was a little farther off Route 30. So Tredyffrin Township and Radnor were practically built off of when Route 30 was there. When that kind of started coming through there, and in the early 1700s, they were building taverns left and right all over the road there, especially in those little townships going east and west. And so you'll see these taverns. But the first Blue Ball Tavern was one of the oldest taverns in Chester County. This is the second one. And I know if you go on the Tredyffrin Township Historic Commission, go on their website, they will have more information on both those taverns. And I'm sure they'll have information on there if what they look like, if there's any current pictures. I know there's a current picture of the old one on there. Okay. So we're going to talk about another man who interests me a lot. And we're going to kind of go in a little bit different part of Chester County here. So this is John Vickers. So John Vickers had a house / tavern / pottery business right off of Route 113. And you can see this this early etching of the residence of John Vickers. That road right there is supposed to be Route 113, by the way. So, but of course, it's an early etching showing an early image that yes, there was farms all around there. 113 in that area of Lineville, Exton and stuff did not look like that, obviously. And so this is John Vickers' house. John was a another one that was a huge player in the Underground Railroad. He was friends with Peart. He was friends with Elijah Pennypacker, and he was a friends, and they had all connections to Mr. Still in Philadelphia, and of course some other big players. Yes, someone said that's yeah, Vickers Tavern is still there and operating. Yes, it is, and I think it's really cool that you can still go there today, and that's what it looks like. It's a really awesome spot, and you can walk into history. This is a public building, public place where you can go in and sit there amongst this stuff that I'm talking about, which is pretty awesome. Mr. Vickers was a potter in Chester County. I like pottery, and the potter that he did was redware pottery. He was a Quaker. So Quaker redware pottery is usually different from Pennsylvania German redware pottery. Usually Quaker pottery was less decorated than Pennsylvania German stuff. So this was there was the pottery business that he did at the time was interesting because he would do kind of a mix of pieces, and this is an example of one of his pieces. This is from 1838, where he actually wrote the woman's name on it, and this one is decorated. And there are a lot of research and information on his pottery at the Chester County Historical Society, which is now the Chester County History Center. Believe it or not, that long ago, I think it was about 8 years ago, some of his at least one of his pieces was up for auction in Downingtown, and I'm sure it went for a pretty penny. But he was a potter, and so a lot of these people of course, they had businesses of their own and tried to operate their own business while operating as a station master location. Someone said, were slaves brought to the Vickers Tavern? Yes, absolutely. The Vickers house, that at the time was his house, and he had a farm location, and he had his pottery there before it became a tavern. But yes, absolutely, brought a lot of slaves through his property, and they went from there a lot of times keep going up 113 to Kimberton. And then from Kimberton, a little bit farther up 113 or up through the back roads there to Elijah Pennypacker's house. So all those people we're talking about that Elijah processed through his property, most of them were processed already through Vickers. So John Vickers was, like I said, a very important person on this Underground Railroad. This is an etching of Grace Ann Lewis. Now, we talked about plenty of guys on the talk tonight, but there were very, very many female abolitionists and female that were involved in the Underground Railroad. So Grace Ann Lewis is one that I like reading about. The Lewises lived outside of Kimberton. At one point originated in Vincent Township, and you have East and West Vincent, and they were closely connected with the families in Kimberton. So Grace Ann was another one who processed hundreds of enslaved people through her property, and her husband. And but Grace Ann was very well respected woman, wrote about her experiences, and is another player. And someone said, yes, of course, women potters as well. Yes, pottery in Chester County is incredible, and yes, there were so many female and male potters in Chester County, all throughout northern, southern, central, wherever. They were all over the place. And the Lewis family, like I said, was very much involved. I think some people here on this talk tonight, of course, you live in the area, are going to know that someone said Grace Ann. I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. Yeah, Grace Ann Lewis was not married. I was thinking about her parents. But the location here, I think a lot of people are going to know where that's at in Kimberton. Kimber Hall. So Mr. Kimber, that Emmer Kimber, of course, was Kimberton. It's named after Emmer Kimber. Was a another abolitionist, of course. He was a Quaker. He had built this building as a Quaker women's school, and the being one of the very early all-female schools at the time in Pennsylvania. And so he had already well established a property, a building, all based around his Quaker religion. And of course, this wound up becoming a station master house run by Mr. Kimber. And like we already mentioned, he was connected with Grace Ann and the Elijah Pennypacker and Vickers and all that family. So, we've talked about a lot of individuals. We showed some different properties and houses and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll see it's hard to find a lot of really good documented stories about individual people that were the enslaved individuals. There are some really good ones, and it really involved people going back to these people and trying to get stories from them. And there's a book that was written, and there was a book that was written in the 1800s, 1880s, that was written by Robert Clement Smedley. It's called The History of the Underground Railroad in Chester and Neighboring Counties of Pennsylvania. This book is a great book. The book, when he wrote this book, of course, in the 1880s, a lot of these people were still alive. And so if they were willing to talk about it, which a lot of them weren't, they were still a little nervous about, the things that they did. And of course that, when the United States government had a law in 1850 that, what they were doing at times technically was illegal. So some of these people were still nervous about talking about what they did, maybe giving up any sort of evidence, documents, anything that they wrote, which some of them did not, like Elijah Pennypacker. So for Mr. Smedley to go around and write this book, he really had to do a lot of digging and talk to a lot of people. And if it wasn't for someone like him, this book would just not, you wouldn't have a book like that to provide a lot of really firsthand accounts, human interest stories. And, thank God he wrote the book, because a lot of this stuff wouldn't really be documented. Elijah Pennypacker did not, as far as they knew, did not keep a record of how many people. Like, he did not keep like a logbook to say, okay, well, this person came through, this person came from this person, and this person came from another location, and they were going this, and I did this. So a lot of them didn't want to keep those books because they were afraid if they got caught, there's the evidence, and that would give them up easily and show everything that they did. So it was very secretive. There's a lot of interesting stories, like I said, I want to mention a couple real quick that are about individual people that were freed by some of these people that were brought into Philadelphia. Elijah Pennypacker actually had processed two people through his location that were, I believe, it was at least about a year or so apart, that were actually a husband and wife. The first person that was processed through there had come through, and he sent them on their way. And then down the road, the spouse came through and processed that person through his property. Those two people wound up actually meeting again and reuniting, and wound up having a family down the road. And it's just a cool story to think of the odds of him processing two different people. He didn't know that these two people were connected at one point, and then after he processed them through, they had reunited. And I believe they reunited. It's either in Norristown or Philadelphia. There's another story where one of the female abolitionists was actually downtown Philadelphia on, I believe it was Walnut Street in Philadelphia, and actually just walked by a woman who was sweeping a sidewalk, and the woman noticed her and kind of like, startled her and said, and she didn't really recognize her right away because it had been multiple years. And she came up and ran up to her and gave her a big hug. And she was like, "Who's this woman?" And then when she explained that what had happened, that here this woman was, she had seen her years ago because she was processed and came through her property. So I'm sure those types of stories happen in the future, and I wish we knew a lot more of them. But like you said, sometimes it took people like Smedley to document some things. If you read Smedley's book, which I highly recommend, read the book because there are a lot more stories in there. He goes into some detail where he talks about a lot more individual people's their actual names. It kind of gives you like a lot of human interest stories, which is usually what I like in a lot of books. The picture that we're showing here is one of the most famous photos associated with the Underground Railroad or the abolitionist movement. The Longwood Progressive Meeting House, which is down, of course, connected with the Kennett Underground Railroad Center and the Chester County Visitors area of the Brandywine Visitors Bureau, I think it is. And it's an 1865 photograph of the meeting house. And it was a real hub to the Underground Railroad, a real prime location that involved a lot of people that came through there. And this building is still standing. I'm going to show you a picture of it now in a minute. But you can go down there and you can see this building. You can visit it. It almost looks exactly the same. Practically, the front windows were a little bit small, made a little bit smaller. But it's an awesome photograph. It's a very published photograph that you see quite a bit.
We do have, sorry to interrupt, Brian. We do have two people asking for you to say the name of the Smedley book again.
The Smedley book is called History of the Underground Railroad in Chester and the Neighboring Counties of Pennsylvania. So, yeah, someone's putting a link up there for Google Books. So, I mean, the first thing I would like to recommend was go to Tredyffrin Library and see if they have it. But go to your library and see if they have it. But it is on Google Books, and you can order like a reprinted like soft copy that was printed like recently on like Amazon or whatever. So it's out there. You can find copies of it easily. So I recommend that book because it's that book is specifically talking about Chester County, and talking about the neighboring counties, not just Chester, which is cool. So there's a lot of people on here that, of course, that are tuned in and that are not from Chester County. So, but the Longwood Progressive Meeting House had speakers and visitors throughout the time of the Underground Railroad. And some of those people are some of the most, if not the most famous people in the history of the Underground Railroad. So you have, of course, Frederick Douglass was here. Harriet Tubman was there. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott, William Lloyd Garrison, Theodore Parker, and Thomas Garrett. And you can't get bigger than that, especially the fact that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were both there. And so when they would do a speech there, people would come and gather and listen to what they had to say. And obviously was influential to a lot of people in that area. There's the building now. As you can see, the Brandywine Valley Tourism Information Center. The building, as you can see, looks pretty similar. You can see they've added this little front piece onto it, and the windows were made a little bit smaller, probably when they did that. But just an awesome building. And like I said, some of these, I wanted to show you that, yes, good point. A lot of suffragists were abolitionists, absolutely, 100%. A lot of this stuff was connected. you know, to me, I always like to explain it as the things that should be, or the things that made sense were usually connected. Suffragists, um, abolitionists, and all that kind of stuff was, involved a lot of the same people. And it was a movement, in the country. And you'll see those names, like that was a really good point, that those names that'll pop up, like Susan B. Anthony. So these were people that just knew what the right thing was and what it should be. And, thank God that we had people like that. You had people like her, and you had people like Frederick Douglass, who traveled around all over the place, and spoke to, random Quakers in southern Chester County. So it's really cool. And like I said, I like to show some of these places where you can go, and still go to these locations, like, here, like Elijah's house, which is, it's private property. I'm not telling people to go on their property, but you can drive by and look at the house, or you can pull into the Schuylkill Friends Meeting House and check it out. And of course, all the other meeting houses in Chester County, like in Tredyffrin and Radnor and those areas, it's awesome that you can still see these locations. And, thankfully, Chester County protected a lot of these locations. And of course, there's stuff that was torn down throughout the years, but we're lucky that we have a decent amount. I wanted to point out another location for you guys that it's just really cool. And as we were talking about the locations that you can still go see, and this is one that I highly recommend. And some of you on here may have seen this. I'm sure there are people that have seen this location, but I've shown this drawing first because we were talking a little bit earlier about the Pennsylvania Germans and how they were involved. And when you get into the Pennsylvania German abolitionists, you're going to see a lot of them in Montgomery County, Lancaster County, Berks County, the real classic areas for Pennsylvania Germans. And when Pennsylvania Germans, of course, really encompass a lot of different, religious sects that were broken off of the Lutheranism. So you had Mennonites, and you have Brethren, and you have the Schwenkfelders and the Goshahoppins and the Brethren and stuff like that. And they was all over the place. And so going out into an area a little bit farther over from Lancaster County, you have Adams County. And for people that are on here know where Adams County, where I'm talking about, of course, Gettysburg. So in Gettysburg, the Underground Railroad came right through Gettysburg, right in the center of Gettysburg. And this here is a photograph of what is called the Dobbins House. And Mr. Dobbins was involved in the operations of the Underground Railroad. And yes, someone said Dobbins House is an awesome place. Yes, it is. So if you go downstairs, I like going down into the tavern part in the bottom where the old tavern is. And it's literally like you're in a 1700s tavern. It's amazing. And you can go there and eat. And then while you're there, you can walk up the steps in the back, and open to the public usually is you can see one of their locations that was a hiding spot during the Underground Railroad. And if you go up the steps on the left there, you can see where it was just like these doors opened up and they closed, and it had shelves in there with some pottery on it. Well, when you move the pottery over, it slides over, that shelf slides over into the back, and in that little crawl space, it goes in there, and there's a big little spot in there where they would have, bedding and food and somewhere where they could rest and sleep hidden behind there, and then it would close it up again. And there was an incident, I believe, that I think it still has, yes, it still has the original spring in the basement. The place is amazing. If you're ever in Gettysburg, that's where I recommend you checking it out, because you can not only can you eat there and get some good food, but you can also see some awesome history. And that's something that you can see right pretty close to you. There's not a lot of really good locations where you can actually visually go and see like a real legitimate hiding spot that's open to the public like that. It's really cool. So check it out. Someone said, what is the name of the place in Gettysburg? It's called the Dobbins House, the Dobbins House Tavern. And so I really wanted to show you guys that. And there you go, Springhouse Tavern at Dobbins House. Yeah. So you have the upstairs, which is a little more fine dining, and then downstairs you have that cool tavern, and it's really neat. But you had things that looked like that in a lot of these places that I was just talking about. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of photos of those things. So a lot of times, something that this was preserved like it was, it just kind of wasn't touched, is awesome. You will see things where there was stuff before, and that they, even in the 1800s, took it out because they were like, oh, this, they were trying to get rid of evidence, in other words. So they, it was done and over with. They wanted to close it up. They knocked it down or whatever it might be. But there are definitely secret locations all over the place in Chester County where a lot of these places are private residences. You do have some meeting houses, of course, that have some stuff still. But it's amazing when you hear about, when I do some talks and stuff like that here and there, that people will say, oh, yeah, well, I live in this house, and, we found this little hiding spot in our house. Because when you hear about these station houses, and those were the main stops, there were definitely little stops in between at some of these old houses that are still standing that you just never know when you're driving around, that you could be passing those locations. So, I see there's a lot of comments. I'm sorry if I can't keep up with them, because you guys are asking a lot of questions, which is good. But I'm going to stop talking, I think, now, and we can get people that want to start asking questions, and I can just answer those questions now for moving forward. But I did want to say, thanks for tuning in. If I, maybe made a couple errors here and there, I do apologize. I'm sure there's a lot of people on here that are, some pretty good experts on the Underground Railroad. And, I always like input and any good questions, or people have some facts they want to share with us. The last talk I did had some people tune in and said, had some amazing information. And so there was a couple people that were on before that lived in a couple of houses that had legitimate Underground Railroad involvement. So, tune in, stay involved. I see another question. I can't ignore it because it's the Phoenixville question. Somebody asked if the Reeves family was involved in the Underground Railroad. For those who don't know who the Reeves family, the Reeves family were very big family in Phoenixville. You had two Reeves mansions that were located on the corner of Star and Bridge Street in Phoenixville. The one is still standing. And they were the people who ran and were presidents of the Phoenix Iron Company and Phoenix Steel from the 1820s into the 1940s. Anyway, they were not necessarily involved, but there are stories of possibility of when Elijah Pennypacker had to bring his enslaved people that he was trying to process through his house. When I'm talking about them crossing the river at the Schuylkill River, it's right there, right on Bridge Street, the intercounty bridge that goes from Montgomery or Chester to Montgomery, from Phoenixville to Montclair. And you have the little fords there where you have Long Ford. So you have those areas. The Reeves Mansion is right there. So there are stories where they believe that they did come through the property there. Reeves was aware of it and was also someone who was like, I support it, and didn't, pretty much didn't tattletale on him, because he easily could have, and he knew what was going on, but let them cross through his property. And I hope that that's all I know about that. And there's not a lot of good evidence on anything more than that, really. So, all right. I guess we could do some questions now, I believe, right?
Sure. I have quite a few questions that I was waiting that we got through the Q&A portion. A lot of people were asking what happened if station masters were caught. And a lot of people were asking about how enslaved people decided on which route to take, or how they knew about the routes.
Yeah, so both really good questions. So, like I said a couple times, that these station masters knew what they were doing was dangerous, and I hate using this term because I would have been, me personally, would have been all about being involved in something like this at the time, but what they were doing was technically illegal, and because the United States government had passed that act. And so if they were caught, they could be arrested and imprisoned. And hopefully it wouldn't go to the point where these bounty hunters, who were very dangerous people, these were people who were literally hunting humans. So, yes, they had to bring them back, alive, obviously, because they were bringing what they referred to as property. But if they encountered some of these people that were station master people, they definitely were in danger of their own life, dealing with any of the bounty hunters. So you had that risk of danger of interaction, which there was plenty of it. And don't and I talked about a lot of positive stories about, they never got caught, this and that, but there were definitely a lot that did get caught and were brought back down south. And some of those people, did get in trouble. But we also remember too, like, unless maybe they were prosecuted by the United States government, the state of Pennsylvania wasn't going to want to be involved in that, because the state of Pennsylvania was already, had abolished slavery. So it created that weird thing going on, which of course, what do you know, happened in 1861. So, some of that stuff is obviously connected with that, that type of stuff. And then the other question, what was the what route? So that's a really good question. And I think the best way to kind of answer that is, there's probably a mix. So one, if the enslaved people that were trying to escape areas of, say, Virginia, parts of Maryland, and parts of Delaware that still had slaves, that if there was somebody that they had some sort of contact with in some form or fashion that could advise them on, hey, go on this route and go on this road and keep going north. Eventually you will run into so and so. That definitely happened. Then you have other people who they knew they just had to get north. And if you ever hear that story of them following the North Star, it's true, because they knew that they were going to go north. They knew that they had to get in that direction. So sometimes they would just randomly go. And if they knew somehow, these are people that had no idea where they were at. So they were trying to run into somebody, hoping that person, I'm going to answer that question here in a second, that was going to be honest and helpful towards them. And by all means, yes, they ran into people in the southern Chester County that were, and I'm sure there was plenty of stories where they ran into people who they didn't want to run into, who turned them in. So depending on who they ran into, or they had some sort of communication, like somebody said about secretive notes. Yes, there were signs, like a little things like, notes, or, X marks the spot, like on a tree. They did develop that kind of stuff for sure. And that's a really good point. So they would follow that route and going to, hopefully, that person who's going to be helpful towards them. So whoever they got to, those people now were in charge of sending them on whatever route they were connected to. So, like you said, if they got into an area, say they eventually, just, got to, I don't know, they found their way to Vickers' house, for instance. Well, Vickers had his direct route that he knew he could send somebody to, was Elijah Pennypacker or Kimber. And so he knew that. So it was all a matter of that connection, all the way from going up to the top, that whatever route they were going. That's the best way to just kind of describe it, and it depends on where they came up. So if they came up through Chester County or through Lancaster County, now they're going to hit that route that went west, or I'm sorry, that went east across the top of Chester County. So it's kind of, I guess, the roundabout answer there, but and
There were
there's a lot. Yeah,
there's
a
a
lot of
lot of
content coming
questions,
in.
which is great. There was another question that was repeated throughout your presentation, the question of using secretive quilts and specifically a fir tree in the yard. Did that kind of denote a station that enslaved people can escape to?
Yes, that's a good one. The quilts are really cool. So they would make those quilts that had specific symbols and things on the quilts that you would, if the person, the general bystander, went by, they're like, oh yeah, well, they're just hanging their quilt off their porch,
Mhm.
to dry it after they cleaned it, or they're beating the dust out of it. Well, if some of those people were in tune to look for those clues or those things on those quilts, then they knew that was a safe spot for them. So yeah, that's a good question for sure. Yeah.
Another question that has come up quite a bit, and there's a lot of different parts of this question. Someone asked, could you explain in further detail what a station master's house would have been like during this time? How many people would be there at any given time? How long did the slaves stay? And did they keep a record of what slaves stayed in their house?
So that would definitely vary upon location. One thing that I had mentioned about, like, Elijah Pennypacker, for instance. As far as they know, he kept no record. He kept no logbook of, you know who he processed and the exact number, because a lot of people like him didn't do that because they were afraid that that was full blown evidence against them. So that if they did get caught and they got their hands on that book, well, you know, there's all your information. So record keeping and that kind of stuff was very minimal. But because once again, it was very dangerous to do anything like that. But yeah, record keeping was not very well done, which relates to being very difficult to give you exact numbers, and how many people that would have been in, say, Vicar's house at one time, or how long did they stay there. Some of that stuff is hard to answer, but generally, what their purpose was is probably generally maybe one night, to stay overnight, depending on, like, if the area knew, like, hey, if there's a bounty hunter in the area and there was word of it, then clearly they would have moved them as fast as they possibly could. If they had to stay one night overnight, they would stay overnight and then get them out in the early morning. And a lot of times when they moved them, of course they're not going to move them in broad daylight. So a lot of times they would move them in the morning when it was still dark. So they would have to wake them up real early in the morning and move them in the darkness. And the same thing, arriving at night. So because it had to be secretive. And so there's a good possibility too of, like, how many you had at one time, depending on how many were traveling together. So if you had a family traveling together with the kids, you might have 4 or 5 people arriving at one point at one house, or you could have 10 people arriving at some. So it really varied. You could you could just have one person, which you'll hear, stories about, like when I talk about Elijah, who had come across the husband and wife that were separated, when they were in Virginia, were separated way before that, and then both came through their house separately. They weren't even together. So you'll hear a lot of stuff like that too. So it's hard to pinpoint, like, exact stuff there, but you kind of had all of it across the board there, where multiple people at one point. You might have had one that stays just one night, or they might have stopped there for an hour and said, we got to keep you moving. Or they might have stayed for multiple nights. If you have somebody like Elijah Pennypacker, who actually had processed one of the enslaved men through his house, he was a young man, young teen, at the time, very young, on his own. he actually wound up living with Elijah Pennypacker for the rest of his life. And if you go to the Schuylkill Friends Meeting House, you will see some African American burials in there. Very, very good chance that any of those ones that are buried in there were probably people that were processed by Elijah. The one that lived with Elijah Pennypacker is buried on the same plot with him and his wife and his children, which is pretty cool. So you can go to the cemetery and walk around, and you can see that there's actually one of the African American graves there is actually a Civil War soldier grave, which is really cool. So it has a military marker as well, so you can't miss it. Any other questions?
We do have a question from Facebook. Gigi says, "Hi Ryan, our 7-year-old wants to know when Sojourner Truth made her way to freedom."
Oh boy. You put me on the spot. I can't tell you the date off the top of my head, but I can tell you that if you're interested in Sojourner Truth, she, like I said, she did that. There was a speech that at the meeting house there at Longwood, that you can actually go there and be in the same building that she was in. So it's pretty cool. But if I had my phone, I could Google it for you. But I'm sorry, I can't give you I can't remember the exact date. But I don't want to give you wrong information either.
Another question that popped up frequently was, where was the end of the line? How did enslaved people know that they reached the end of the line? And then another question came in that's, I'm assuming, is kind of related. Lisa asks, is there a specific building in Philadelphia where freedom seekers were processed?
Yeah, so the end of the line kind of stuff, which is really interesting, it really could vary. Now, depending on where those say they got to, Elijah Pennypacker. I keep using Elijah Pennypacker, but say they get to his house, he's now going to be the one that's going to need to tell them that you're at the end of the line now, or you need to go farther north, or you need to go over to Philadelphia. So it really, depended on those people to give them that information. There you go. Sojourner Truth was emancipated in 1827. And so, not only did they, of course, go to Philadelphia, I keep talking about our area specifically, but they went as far north. There's a lot of them that went into Canada. And of course, Sojourner Truth in New York, they went up to New York City. They went up into, upstate New York, into New England, of course. And like I said, there's a lot of them that went up to Canada because they're pretty much like, I'm going to keep going until I get out of this country completely. So, I think one of them just wanted to get as far away as they possibly could. So there really was no, like, you're at the end of the line, you can't go any farther north. They pretty much could go wherever they want as long as they were safe, had some guidance, and found a stopping point. But, you will see a lot of them stop in northern Chester County, and they go across over into Montgomery, across the Schuylkill River, and a lot of them wound up in Philadelphia, and a lot in Norristown as well. And some did go up to Reading, Pennsylvania, into Berks County, because that's a whole other talk, because I tried to focus a lot of this just on Chester County, but Berks County was very, very involved in the Underground Railroad, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the Pennsylvania Germans. So, could bounty hunters pursue people in Canada? I believe the answer to that was no, because they couldn't cross over into another country. So, yeah. So if I was me, I'll answer that question in a second, the route question, but I can show the map again. If people want to see the map, I don't know, some people maybe missed it in the beginning, but, if people knew they can get out of the United States, then they knew they were pretty darn safe for them, they're out of the country into Canada. So yes, some people want to see the map. So I'm gonna bring that up while I'm talking here.
Sure. Several people actually asked if it were possible to share your presentation or share the photos. I would be happy to email all of the attendees or registrants if you're willing to share your maps, Brian.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Okay, I'm going to bring this map up here. This is the better Chester County one. I'm going to turn it here for you guys. So this is the definitely one of the best ones of Chester County. Kind of shows you the routes. As you can see from the colors, purple, red, and green are the three main routes through Chester County. As you can see, they were coming from different counties and in different counties. And you can see, I'm going to zoom in here for you guys, where you can see how these routes would come in. Here's Wilmington, Delaware. Another Thomas Garrett, huge involved in the Underground Railroad. That's why they're coming from his house, and they're coming right into Kennett, right into Pennsbury, Route 1, Route 202. These are old routes that were coming right up through Westchester. I mean, right, as you can see, right through the center of Westchester, right through the center of Downingtown, Malvern, Euclid, Tredyffrin, Phoenixville. So the Malvern one, here's the purple one. That one took a quick turn and goes right to Upper Darby in Delaware County. And that goes right into Philadelphia. So I do highly recommend, if you're interested in this stuff, definitely go to the Chester County Historical Society, because they have a tremendous amount of stuff on the Underground Railroad. In fact, they did an exhibit years ago that was incredible, where they have actual documented original artifacts, including shackles from documented enslaved people that came up through the Underground Railroad in Chester County. It's pretty crazy. So you can see these little routes, these gray lines. Those are the small routes connecting all those places. So you have, someone had mentioned the Hosanna Church. There it is. And see how those, it's just like all over Chester County. It's like a spider web. But those big routes, those are the big ones. And those are the main ones. As you can see, they go through different parts of Chester County. So any other new questions?
I'm still muted. So it looks like we hit at least all of the questions that were repeated or frequent questions. There was a couple people asking about a church. I'm not sure I found one. It was the Star Hill AME Church in Camden, Wyoming, Delaware on Route 113, a part of the Underground Railroad. I think that was, someone asked about that church earlier in your presentation as well.
Well, that's a good question. So I know it's a possibility. Now, the AME Church, of course, is the early African American denomination that had churches right into that areas of Delaware in the Chester County. A lot of them were pre-Civil War, which then if it was a pre-Civil War AME church, then there's a pretty darn good possibility that it was. So, like, say for instance, Phoenixville has a AME, Grimes AME church, and that church congregation didn't start until the late 1860s. There was an African American population in Phoenixville, but that church itself didn't start till after the Civil War. So there's a lot of AME churches that started either right after the Civil War or before the Civil War. And those before ones, of course, would be the ones that would be involved in the Underground Railroad. Yeah, that's one thing, important to keep in mind. Like I mentioned, Chester County had a very decent population of African Americans in Chester County before the Underground Railroad started. And Phoenixville being a location, Westchester, Coatesville, and those areas had populations. And it's something to keep in mind when you think about here you say Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. Yeah, those AME churches in Philadelphia were, I mean, don't quote me on this, but almost if any of them were standing before the Civil War, probably were involved in the Underground Railroad, most likely. I mean, Philadelphia was unbelievably involved, if not maybe the most important location for the Underground Railroad in the entire country. So, Philadelphia, because it had such an early, huge population of Quakers, that they were so involved in the abolitionist movement that when these early laws that came out, like the 1780 law, yeah, that's because Philadelphia was pushing. You had so much of it in our area, and you can really, really honestly thank our area for a lot of those things that happened, like that early stuff, because other parts of the country, definitely were not involved, unless you get into like areas of like some New England areas where you have some pretty strong abolitionist movements. So, any other questions, or if people want, maybe if anybody wants to see another photograph, I can bring it up. But I don't know if there's any. A lot of people are chiming out now, I think.
Looks like the questions have slowed down, but you're getting a lot of thanks for a lot of the info and your presentation. So everyone's very thankful and grateful.
Yeah, I appreciate all the compliments. If I don't answer all your questions, sorry, there's a million questions that are popping up. But I've seen some people like comment on there, like, what's my contact information? My name is Ryan Conroy. You can find me, on Facebook. If you want to send me a message through Facebook or Instagram, I'll definitely answer you. And I've done Underground Railroad talks a handful of times within the past year for different areas. So I had to learn some new stuff because I always focus a lot of stuff on for a long time on Phoenixville specifically because there's so much. But I do a lot on Berks County as well, and now encompass more of Chester County. But going into getting into the whole Philadelphia thing, obviously that's a whole other it's a whole other talk. But feel free to, if you want to reach out to me, through those outlets, like I said, I'll answer you. And, I'm always open to more talks. And, I have, I like doing talks for libraries and local nonprofits and, different, I did a couple of these talks for a couple local African-American churches, which was pretty cool because I got to do the talks in some of those locations. So it was kind of neat. So, but yeah, that's the best way to contact me if you're interested. So a couple of people comment that. So, all
Great.
right.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Tredyffrin Public Library really thanks you for presenting on the Underground Railroad in Chester County. We would be delighted to have you back if you have more. I'm sure you have tons of information about the Underground Railroad just in Pennsylvania alone. So we would be delighted to have you back at any point.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'd definitely like to do another one if people want to hear more of my talking.
All right, so do you have any final comments or thoughts of your presentation?
Yeah, no, that's definitely just wanted to thank people for tuning in again. The turnout was very large for a talk like this, and especially nowadays. I'm used to doing a lot of my talks in person, and so I've had to get used to the Zoom talks. So it's funny how even something like that, where I'm more of a personal person. I like to be in front of people, but it is ironic that when we get forced to a format like this, that we can reach out to more people, because as we saw, the people that were tuning in from all over the world, literally, for a Zoom talk, that normally wouldn't be able to hear maybe this information for a talk, which is pretty cool. So I definitely think it's a format that should continue to be used even when we are back to normal. But yeah, and yeah, I said I actually, as I'm talking here, I'm getting several friend requests on Facebook. So I'll try and get back to you guys. But yeah, so I appreciate it. But I definitely, like I said, promote public libraries and local historical societies. That's where you're going to find this information. I'm just an average person that just did the research on my own. So you can go to those locations. And like I said, Chester County Historical Society is amazing. I'm involved, obviously, with Phoenixville and Springford. We both have museums, and we need your support as well, because we're both nonprofit organizations that rely on the support of the community. So, donations and support for events and stuff like that is what we really need. And so if you guys are interested in more local history, definitely check out all those locations. They all have museums, and of course those places that I mentioned during the talk in Kennett that has the Underground Railroad Museum. So check out that stuff, and stay tuned for more talks I'm doing in the area on subjects that are completely opposite of the Underground Railroad. So if you're interested in military history, history of immigration in Pennsylvania, and I do a talk on photography. So just stay tuned, I guess. But yeah, just thanks again for everybody. I appreciate it.
Great.
It.
Thank you again. So we'll see when Ryan can come back to the library. In the meantime, follow us on Facebook, and we'll let you know when Ryan returns to do another lecture.
All righty. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.